Earth had long been forgotten by the galaxy, an insignificant blue dot orbiting a distant sun. Once a player in the galactic stage, humanity had receded, leaving little more than whispers of its former influence. The Galactic Empire, an alliance of warlords who had expanded their dominion over countless planets, turned its gaze toward Earth. To them, it was just another primitive world to conquer, a footnote in their unrelenting expansion. When the warlords' fleet appeared in Earth's sky, few even knew what was happening. The people of Earth were no longer warriors, no longer the force they had once been. Their military had decayed, technology had advanced elsewhere, and they were nothing more than an easy target, or so it seemed. From the heart of the Empire's flagship, General Vorta stood on the bridge, gazing at the planet below. Vorta, a hulking mass of armor and flesh, was the first of the warlords chosen to lead the invasion. His race had conquered 100 worlds before this one, and he didn't expect Earth to be any different. "Send the message," Vorta growled, his voice a deep rumble. "They will surrender, or we will burn them to the ground." The message was sent, but there was no reply. No formal surrender, no resistance, just silence from Earth. Vorta, always one for direct confrontation, ordered the first wave of troops to land. Below, on Earth's surface, the once bustling cities lay quiet, not out of fear, but out of a sense of hopelessness. They had no armies, no defense systems. To the average citizen, it was as if the world had already ended. But not everyone on Earth had forgotten what it meant to fight. In an underground bunker, a group of officials stood around a table. Their faces were grim, their options few. They knew what was coming, and they knew they had nothing to match the invaders' firepower. But then, one man spoke up, his voice low but steady. "There is still one option," he said. The others turned to him, confusion etched on their faces. "One option? We have no armies, no fleets. What are you talking about?" The man looked around the room, his gaze hard. "We send him." At first, there was silence. Then murmurs of disbelief. "He's just one man," someone said. "What can he possibly do against an entire invasion force?" The man's lips curled into a grim smile. "He's not just a man. He's the last of the gunslingers." In the depths of the bunker, a door hissed open, and there, standing in the dim light, was the gunslinger. He was tall and broad, his face weathered and scarred from battles long past. Strapped to his hip was a weapon, a ballistic pistol, ancient by modern standards. Across his back was a long rifle, similarly outdated. To anyone in the galaxy, he would seem like a relic, something from a bygone era. But on Earth, he was their last hope. The gunslinger said nothing as he walked through the corridor. He needed no instructions. His mission was clear. He had been trained for this his entire life, a life spent in the shadows, waiting for the day he would be called upon to defend his world. He moved through the empty streets of the city, his steps soundless. Above, the invaders descended. Vorta's forces were an overwhelming presence, their ships casting shadows over the land. The warlord himself, encased in his indestructible armor, stood at the forefront. His plasma cannons were aimed at the city's tallest buildings, ready to obliterate any sign of resistance. But there was no army waiting for them. No organized defense. Just one man, standing in the rubble, his hat pulled low over his eyes, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. Vorta laughed, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the empty streets. "Is this Earth's champion?" he roared. "One man? You send one man to face me?" The gunslinger didn't respond. He just stood there, still as a statue, his eyes locked on Vorta. The warlord, amused by the apparent futility of the situation, gestured to his soldiers. "Kill him!" The first wave of troops rushed forward, their weapons glowing with lethal energy. The gunslinger didn't move until the very last moment. Then, in a blur of motion, he drew his pistol. A single shot rang out, and the first soldier dropped, a hole clean through his helmet. Another shot, and a second soldier fell. The energy shields that should have protected them were useless against the ballistic rounds, old technology, but deadly in its simplicity. Vorta's amusement quickly faded, replaced by irritation. "What are you waiting for?" he barked. "Take him down!" The soldiers pressed forward, but the gunslinger was faster. His movements were precise, his aim perfect. Every shot hit its mark. Troops fell one by one, unable to close the distance. Their plasma weapons, far more advanced than the gunslinger's old-fashioned guns, couldn't land a single hit on him. He was always one step ahead, always in the right place at the right time. Vorta watched in disbelief as his forces were decimated by this lone warrior. This wasn't supposed to happen. Earth was supposed to be easy. He had led invasions before, crushed planets with his superior firepower. But now, here he was, watching his men fall to a man using ancient technology. With a roar of frustration, Vorta himself stepped forward, his plasma cannon charged and ready. "Enough!" he shouted. "I'll handle this myself." The gunslinger holstered his pistol and drew his rifle. He knew this fight wasn't over yet. Vorta was no ordinary soldier. The warlord was a monster, his strength and technology unmatched by anything the gunslinger had faced before. But that didn't matter. The two stood facing each other, a vast gap of ruined streets between them. Vorta raised his cannon, and the gunslinger steadied his rifle. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a flash of light, Vorta fired. The plasma bolt streaked across the battlefield, but the gunslinger was already moving, rolling to the side and returning fire. His bullet struck Vorta's armor, but it barely made a dent. The warlord laughed, a sound filled with cruelty. "You think you can stop me with that?" Vorta taunted, advancing slowly, his cannon charging for another blast. The gunslinger said nothing. He just reloaded, took aim, and fired again. This time, he aimed for Vorta's exposed joints. The bullet found its mark, and Vorta staggered, his advance halted. For the first time, Vorta hesitated. The gunslinger was no ordinary opponent. He was fast, precise, and relentless. Each shot was calculated, each move a step toward victory. Vorta fired again, but the gunslinger was already gone, disappearing into the shadows, reappearing only to strike. It was a dance of death, and Vorta was losing. In a final, desperate move, Vorta charged, intending to crush the gunslinger with brute force. But as he closed the distance, the gunslinger sidestepped, drawing his pistol and firing a single, perfectly timed shot. The bullet pierced Vorta's helmet, shattering the warlord's faceplate. The giant alien staggered, dropping to his knees, the plasma cannon falling from his hands. He looked up at the gunslinger, disbelief in his eyes, as his life faded away. The gunslinger holstered his pistol and turned away, walking into the night, leaving the broken warlord behind. The invasion was far from over. More would come. But Earth wasn't defenseless. Not as long as the gunslinger stood ready to fight. Vorta's defeat sent shockwaves through the Galactic Empire. It wasn't the loss of troops or even the destruction of technology that disturbed the higher ranks of the warlords. It was the fact that one man had done it. One human with obsolete weapons had managed to outmaneuver, outthink, and outfight a force that had toppled entire civilizations. The Empire's command wasn't just furious, they were embarrassed. It was the kind of shame that demanded swift and merciless retribution. This wasn't just a planetary conquest anymore, this had become personal. The Council of Warlords convened, and they agreed, Earth would fall, and its champion would be crushed. But this time, they wouldn't rely on a single warlord to lead the charge. Two warlords, each with their own specialized skills, were chosen to bring Earth to its knees. The first, Sarek, was a master of robotics and cyber warfare. His army was composed of machines, perfect, calculating, and emotionless, built for efficiency in combat. The second, Korin, was a psychic warlord with abilities that could bend the minds of weaker beings to his will. He could reach into their thoughts, twist their memories, and break their spirit before ever touching them. As the massive Empire's ships once again descended toward Earth, the citizens below remained unaware. News of the first warlord's defeat had spread quietly, but few truly believed in any hope. Earth had become so distant from the rest of the galaxy that many still didn't grasp the magnitude of the threat they faced. Even fewer believed that one man could make a difference. But in the shadows, the gunslinger was preparing. He knew more were coming. He knew they would send their best, and he knew he was once again on his own. This didn't trouble him. He had lived his whole life as a warrior, trained in the ancient arts of combat that most had forgotten. Solitude was his ally, silence his weapon. He had already begun to prepare the battlefield. The ruins of Earth's cities provided cover, the broken skyscrapers and debris forming a landscape that was as much a part of his defense as his weapons. He understood terrain. He understood patience. The gunslinger moved through the empty streets, setting traps, planting devices, ensuring that every corner and every alleyway would become a part of his strategy. He wasn't going to win by brute force, he never had. He would win by making the warlords fight on his terms. When Sarek arrived, he wasted no time. His machines were efficient, cold, and methodical. They spread through the streets like a plague, scanning for any sign of human life. Their advanced sensors picked up the faintest heat signatures, the smallest movements. They were relentless. But they weren't human. They didn't think like humans. And that was their flaw. The gunslinger watched from the shadows as the machines spread out. He didn't engage them immediately. Instead, he waited, observed, learning their patterns, their weaknesses. He noticed how they communicated, how they coordinated. Every action they took was calculated, precise, and predictable. The first trap was simple, a line of EMP charges, hidden in the rubble. As the machines crossed the threshold, the charges detonated, sending out a pulse that scrambled their circuits. Half of Sarek's forces dropped in an instant, their systems fried, their bodies crumpling to the ground. The others adjusted quickly, reconfiguring their approach, but the damage was done. The element of surprise was gone, and now they had to hunt in a city designed to hide their prey. The gunslinger moved quickly, darting between the debris, taking out individual machines with well-placed shots. His ballistic rounds tore through their metal bodies, bypassing the energy shields that would have stopped most advanced weaponry. The machine's inability to adapt in real time became their downfall. Each one was just another target, and the gunslinger picked them off one by one. Sarek, watching from his command center, seethed with frustration. This was supposed to be a flawless operation. His machines were designed for situations like this, yet they were falling to one man. It was unthinkable. But Sarek wasn't just a warlord, he was an inventor. His machines had contingency protocols, and he activated them without hesitation. The remaining drones reorganized, forming squads and deploying aerial units to track the gunslinger's position from above. They began to lock onto his movements, herding him toward the center of the city. The gunslinger had anticipated this. As they pressed him into what they believed was a corner, he was already thinking several steps ahead. He led them through the city's underpasses, using the tall buildings as cover. The drones circled overhead, and the ground units closed in, confident they had trapped him. Then, with a quick hand, he detonated the charges he had planted in the surrounding buildings. The explosions sent tons of concrete and steel crashing down, crushing the machines beneath the debris. The drones lost their tracking signals, and the gunslinger disappeared from their sensors once again. Sarek's forces were in disarray, but they weren't finished yet. The warlord himself descended from his command ship, furious and determined to face this enemy head-on. His personal armor was integrated with the same cybernetic systems that powered his machines, giving him superior strength and reflexes. He believed that, unlike his drones, he could adapt and crush the human with sheer force. The gunslinger emerged from the shadows, rifle at the ready. Sarek, towering over him, wasted no time in launching his attack. His armor made him nearly invulnerable, and he charged at the gunslinger with mechanical precision. Plasma blasts fired from his gauntlets, but the gunslinger dodged with inhuman speed, rolling to cover behind a crumbling wall. It was a battle of contrasts, Sarek, powerful and imposing, relying on brute strength and technology. The gunslinger, nimble and calculating, using the environment to his advantage. Sarek's strikes were deadly, but the gunslinger never allowed him to close the distance. In a flash, the gunslinger holstered his rifle and drew his pistol. With a precise shot, he aimed for the one vulnerable spot on Sarek's armor, a joint exposed during his attack. The bullet found its mark, and Sarek stumbled, his systems momentarily glitching. That moment was all the gunslinger needed. He dashed forward, his knife drawn, and plunged it into the exposed wiring at Sarek's neck. Sparks flew as the warlord's body convulsed, his systems short-circuiting. With a final shove, the gunslinger pulled the knife free, and Sarek collapsed, defeated. But there was no time to celebrate. Even as Sarek's body hit the ground, the air grew heavy with a strange presence. Corrin had arrived. The psychic warlord didn't need machines or brute strength. His power lay in the mind, and as soon as he set foot on the battlefield, the gunslinger felt his influence. The world around him began to warp, reality bending under the weight of Corrin's psychic abilities. But the gunslinger had faced worse. He had trained for this, endured psychological conditioning that few others could withstand. And as the psychic warlord stepped forward, his eyes glowing with power, the gunslinger tightened his grip on his weapons. This fight wasn't over yet. The death of Sarek only deepened the Empire's resolve to crush the human who had defied their power. But this was no longer just about vengeance. It was about restoring their reputation across the galaxy. The Council of Warlords had already underestimated Earth twice, and they wouldn't make the same mistake again. Corrin, the psychic warlord, had been chosen specifically because of his unique ability to not just destroy an enemy physically, but to break them mentally. Corrin's power was infamous across the Empire. Entire planetary leaders had surrendered to him without a single shot being fired. His abilities allowed him to invade minds, twisting thoughts, warping perceptions, and breaking wills. Where brute force failed, Corrin's psychic mastery always succeeded. As Corrin descended to Earth, the remnants of Sarek's robotic forces lay in smoking heaps across the battlefield, their mechanical forms scattered in pieces across the city ruins. The gunslinger had retreated into the shadows, anticipating the next wave of the invasion, but he had no way of knowing what kind of enemy was about to face him. Corrin moved silently through the wreckage, his feet never touching the ground. The air around him shimmered with a faint, almost invisible glow, a side effect of the psychic field that constantly emanated from him. He didn't need troops. He didn't need machines. He was an army of one, and in his mind, the gunslinger didn't stand a chance. But the gunslinger wasn't one to be easily intimidated. He had fought many battles, and while he had never faced a psychic warlord before, he had learned long ago that every enemy had a weakness. Corrin's power might be overwhelming, but the gunslinger believed there was always a way to win. Corrin didn't attack immediately. He preferred a more methodical approach, one that would dismantle the gunslinger from the inside. As he moved closer, he reached out with his mind, probing the gunslinger's thoughts, searching for the cracks in his mental defenses. For most beings, this would be the end, the moment when their thoughts were laid bare, their fears exploited, and their will shattered. But the gunslinger's mind was a fortress. Decades of battle had hardened him, and while Corrin could sense the memories, he couldn't penetrate them. Instead, he felt only a cold, steely determination, one that had been forged through years of hardship. This wasn't a man who would break easily. Corrin smiled to himself. This would be more interesting than he had expected. He changed his tactic, focusing not on breaking into the gunslinger's mind but on manipulating his perceptions. The world around the gunslinger began to warp. The streets shifted, the buildings twisted, and the familiar ruins became a distorted maze. The gunslinger's surroundings no longer made sense. Paths led nowhere, sounds echoed from impossible directions, and the horizon bent in unnatural ways. Corrin wanted the gunslinger to feel lost, disoriented, confused. This was the first step in breaking him down. But the gunslinger didn't panic. He had been trained to fight in all conditions, and even though the landscape around him no longer obeyed the laws of reality, he trusted his instincts. He moved cautiously, keeping his senses sharp, knowing that Corrin was nearby, watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. As the gunslinger navigated the twisted streets, Corrin reached deeper into his mind, pulling at memories long buried. Suddenly, the gunslinger was no longer in the ruins of Earth. He was back on the battlefield, years ago, surrounded by the bodies of his fallen comrades. The scene was so real, so vivid, that for a moment, the gunslinger could almost believe it was true. He could hear their voices, see their faces, feel the heat of the battle raging around him. This was Corrin's true power, the ability to make his victims relive their worst moments, to trap them in their own memories and force them to experience their pain over and over again until they broke. The gunslinger's comrades, people he had fought beside for years, appeared before him, their eyes filled with accusation, blaming him for their deaths. The weight of guilt, of loss, pressed down on him like a vice. But the gunslinger wasn't just any soldier. He had spent years preparing for moments like this, enduring psychological conditioning that had hardened his mind against such manipulation. He knew that what he was seeing wasn't real, and though the pain of the memory was raw, he forced himself to push through it. His training had taught him to separate illusion from reality, and even now, in the midst of Corrin's psychic assault, he clung to that discipline. Corrin watched from a distance, feeling the gunslinger's resistance. Most would have broken by now, but this human was different. There was something inside him, a core of iron that refused to bend. Corrin intensified his assault, digging deeper into the gunslinger's mind, searching for something that could truly break him. He reached into the gunslinger's darkest memories, pulling forth every fear, every regret, every failure. But the gunslinger didn't falter. His mind, though battered by the psychic storm, held firm. He had lost comrades before. He had faced death countless times. This was just another battle, another enemy to outlast. Corrin's frustration grew. He could feel the gunslinger's resolve, and it infuriated him. This was supposed to be easy. He had broken stronger minds than this, reduced leaders to quivering wrecks with a single thought. But this man, this lone warrior, was resisting him at every turn. Corrin decided it was time to end this. He gathered his power, focusing all of his psychic energy into a single, overwhelming strike. The gunslinger's mind would shatter under the force of it. There would be no defense, no escape. But as Corrin prepared to unleash his final attack, the gunslinger moved. With lightning speed, he drew his pistol and fired, not at Corrin directly, but at the ground near his feet. A flash of light erupted from the impact, a specially designed grenade that emitted an intense pulse of energy. It wasn't enough to hurt Corrin physically, but it was designed to disrupt psychic abilities, scrambling the signals in his mind for just a moment. That moment was all the gunslinger needed. In the split second that Corrin's concentration faltered, the gunslinger closed the distance between them. His knife was in his hand before Corrin could react, and with a single swift motion, the blade found its mark. It pierced Corrin's side, where his psychic defenses were weakest, cutting through the layers of energy that protected him. Corrin gasped, his psychic hold on the gunslinger slipping away. He staggered back, clutching the wound, disbelief etched on his face. No one had ever gotten this close to him before. No one had ever resisted him like this. The gunslinger didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, delivering the final blow with a calculated strike, his blade sinking deep into Corrin's chest. The psychic warlord crumpled to the ground, his power fading as his life drained away. The gunslinger stood over him, breathing hard but steady. He wiped the blood from his blade and holstered his weapon. Corrin had been a formidable opponent, but in the end, he was just another warlord, another challenge overcome. The invasion wasn't over. More would come. But the gunslinger had proven once again that no matter how advanced the enemy, no matter how overwhelming the odds, humanity was far from beaten. And as long as the gunslinger stood, Earth would never fall. The Empire had underestimated Earth for the last time. The deaths of Vorda, Sarek, and Corrin had rippled across the galaxy, spreading like wildfire. The story of the lone gunslinger standing against the might of the Galactic Empire reached planets far beyond Earth. For the Warlords, it was no longer a matter of conquest, it was a matter of pride. The Council convened for one final time, and they agreed on a new plan. There would be no more individual warlords sent to test Earth's defenses. This time, they would strike with overwhelming force. The remaining warlords pooled their resources, sending the full might of their combined armies in one final assault. It wasn't just about crushing the Gunslinger. It was about wiping Earth from existence, leaving nothing but ashes in its place. Above the skies of Earth, the largest fleet the Empire had ever assembled appeared in the atmosphere, blotting out the sun. The Warlords wanted to send a clear message: resistance was futile, and defiance would be met with total annihilation. From the fleet descended not one or two warlords, but an entire battalion of elite forces, each one a master of destruction in their own right. They brought with them weapons that could vaporize cities, machines that could tear apart mountains, and technology that dwarfed anything Earth had ever seen. But the Gunslinger didn't flinch. He stood at the ready, knowing that this was the moment he had trained for his entire life. All of the years spent in preparation, all of the battles he had fought, this was the culmination of everything he had become. The odds were impossible, but that had never stopped him before. The first wave hit the ground like a storm. Troops poured out of the ships, marching in perfect formation, their armor gleaming under the faint sunlight. They were armed to the teeth, each one a lethal soldier in their own right, trained in the art of war. But the Gunslinger had no intention of fighting them head-on. He knew that against such numbers, a direct confrontation would be suicide. Instead, he did what he always did: he used the environment, the terrain, and his experience to his advantage. The city ruins became his battlefield once again. He had spent days setting traps, studying the routes the invaders would likely take. As the troops advanced, explosions rocked the streets, taking out entire squads in seconds. Mines hidden in the rubble, explosives planted in the collapsed buildings. Every step the invaders took was a gamble, and many of them didn't survive long enough to realize it. But the Gunslinger wasn't just relying on traps. He was in constant motion, darting through the shadows, picking off soldiers with precise shots from his rifle. Every shot counted, and every shot found its mark. He targeted the leaders first, knowing that without direction the troops would falter. And falter they did. Confusion spread through their ranks as their commanders fell, and in the chaos, the Gunslinger struck with deadly efficiency. The warlords watching from above couldn't believe what they were seeing. They had sent an entire army to crush one man, and yet, their forces were being systematically dismantled. But this was no ordinary battle. The Gunslinger had become something more than just a warrior. He had become a symbol. He was fighting not just for Earth, but for the idea that no matter how powerful the enemy, the human spirit couldn't be broken. As the battle raged on, the warlords grew impatient. They deployed their most dangerous weapons: tanks that hovered above the ground, firing plasma cannons that could level buildings in a single shot, and aerial drones that blanketed the skies, seeking out the Gunslinger's position with ruthless precision. The warlords were done playing games. They wanted Earth reduced to rubble, and the Gunslinger dead. The Gunslinger knew this was the final push. He could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him, the exhaustion creeping into his bones. But he didn't allow it to slow him. He moved with purpose, his mind clear, his focus sharp. The drones circled above, hunting him, but he had anticipated their arrival. He had positioned anti-air guns in key locations throughout the city, and as the drones flew over, the guns opened fire, cutting through the swarms and sending them crashing to the ground. But the tanks were a different challenge. Their armor was nearly impenetrable, and their plasma cannons left nowhere to hide. The Gunslinger had to rely on his agility, moving through the city like a ghost, never staying in one place for long. He used the debris to his advantage, slipping between the ruins, avoiding the tanks' targeting systems. Then, in a moment of calm between the chaos, the Gunslinger saw his opportunity. One of the tanks had moved too far ahead of the others, exposing its flank. The Gunslinger moved swiftly, planting charges along its vulnerable side. He stepped back just as the explosion ripped through the air, sending the tank toppling over, its plasma cannon destroyed. The battle dragged on, the warlords throwing everything they had at the Gunslinger, but it wasn't enough. One by one, their forces were whittled down, their advanced technology rendered useless by the sheer determination of a single man. The warlords, watching from their ships, were in disbelief. They had thought this would be an easy victory, a simple show of force to erase their previous failures. But now, they were witnessing the impossible. In a final act of desperation, the warlords themselves descended to the battlefield, determined to end this with their own hands. These were beings who had conquered entire star systems, who had never known defeat. Their pride demanded that they face the Gunslinger directly. They landed in the heart of the city, their towering forms radiating power. Each warlord was a master of destruction, and together, they believed they would finally bring the Gunslinger to his knees. They spread out, flanking him from all sides, their weapons drawn, their eyes burning with fury. The Gunslinger stood his ground. He was tired, battered from the relentless fight, but his resolve hadn't wavered. This was it, the final battle. He gripped his pistol tightly, his gaze steady, and then, without a word, the fight began. The warlords attacked as one, their weapons tearing through the air, but the Gunslinger moved faster than they could have imagined. He ducked, rolled, and fired with pinpoint accuracy, his bullets finding weak spots in their armor. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he wasn't fighting to win by sheer force, he was fighting with strategy, with precision, using every advantage the environment could give him. One warlord fell, then another. The Gunslinger didn't stop, didn't hesitate, until only one remained, the leader of the warlords, a figure towering over the ruins, his body encased in a suit of near-invincible armor. The final warlord unleashed a barrage of plasma fire, but the Gunslinger was already moving, weaving through the debris, his pistol a blur as he returned fire. In a final, desperate charge, the warlord lunged at the Gunslinger, but with one last shot, the Gunslinger hit the mark, a critical joint in the warlord's armor. The giant crumbled, collapsing in a heap of broken metal and defeat. The battlefield fell silent. The warlords were dead, their forces decimated, their invasion crushed. The Gunslinger stood alone, breathing hard, his weapons still smoking. He had done the impossible. Earth had been saved, not by armies or fleets, but by one man who refused to give in, no matter the odds. And as the remnants of the Empire's fleet retreated, leaving Earth behind, the legend of the Gunslinger spread across the galaxy.